Welcome to the Art of Marketing Operations, a Taylor podcast. I'm Glenn Bottomley, and today my guest is Debra Schad, Senior Manager for Global Country Marketing at Indeed, the #1 job site in the world with over 300 million unique visitors every month, connecting millions of people to new job opportunities. Thanks for joining us today, Debra.
It's great to be here.
Well, Debra, to start off, I noticed when we originally got connected, I noticed that in your LinkedIn profile, you put under the values section this word perseverance. Now, this word can tend to evoke a lot of imagery and emotion. So why is that word so important to you?
Really good question. And I actually went back and forth on that word a lot because it is such a personalized word for so many people. For me, perseverance is not giving up when it gets tough. It's not finding ways to take the easy route. It's struggling through those moments when you have challenges, looking for opportunities. It's continuing on the road, no matter how many times you have to adjust and pivot to reach that end goal.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, it's anything worthwhile is difficult and can be challenging. Right. And recognizing the challenge is sometimes, I think, if you think of it as the journey is just as important as the end point or the accomplishment. The journey can be just as much fun, but just as much challenging.
Right, and you learn from the journey.
Yeah,
that's where you really learn kind of what you're made of and what the skills you gain during the journey are the ones that take you through the rest of your career. So I think that, and it also leans in a bit to resiliency. So that word is tossed around a lot nowadays, especially since the pandemic. But resiliency is getting, back up, right? It's continuing to get back up every time. I think perseverance is not only just continuing to get back up every time, but still on that path, right? So you're not getting knocked down and saying, okay, yeah, I'm going to get back up again. You're saying, I'm going to get back up and I'm going to get back on that path and I'm going to make sure that that goal gets accomplished.
Well, and you talk a bit about career, and so I'd like to dig into some of that because you've had some really formative experiences in your career. Before Indeed, I know that you were at Adidas. And one of the things that I remember we talked about when we met before was that at that time you were working with probably 20 plus teams across the entire organization globally. So when you were there and when you're working with teams of that size and magnitude, how have you been able to determine or how do you determine the most important ways that your marketing operations teams work across an organization of that scale?
Right. I think the key for me, and it's something that I did learn along the way, was you have to build a good foundation. So marketing operations is only as strong as the foundation that you build. Marketing is only as strong as that foundation. And the operations group, which, is really the tactical get things done. We're not necessarily the creative ones that are out there putting together the stuff that you see. It's the stuff that needs to happen, right? So all those processes and procedures and the way of working that needs to happen so that those people can walk in and say, hey, I've got this great creative plan to get this many more people to understand what our mission is and what our vision is. When you're working in a very matrixed organization, when you're working with a global group of partners, you have to understand what those connection points are and really where you fit into those, like to understand what the impact is. So if I'm working with you, I need to understand how we intersect and at what moments we intersect, at what milestones do we intersect, so that I can understand how best to help you and be able to tell you how best to help me. So for me, that was the foundation that I built, was trying to find ways for 20 different, because those are 20 different stakeholder groups who have 20 different ways of thinking and 20 different ways of intersection points with you. You have to really take it from the ground level up. You have to say, how do we work together in the most effective and efficient way while still not making it so solid and rigid that you can't break away from that structure without it being complicated. So that was one of the things, was really building a strong foundation and creating those intersection points and understanding what that larger picture looked like.
Well, in those 20 teams that you mentioned, different ways of communicating, but also those there would be 20 different sets of incentives, 20 different sets of targets and goals. So in the communication process that you would have with them, how do you sort of tease out what data or reporting, or you talked about deeply understanding what motivates them, understanding what they need, and so forth. But how would that then translate back into the actions you would take with your team to then say, so here's what you're looking for?
Right. It's interesting because I've come from very different backgrounds at a lot of the different companies, because some of them are very rigid and very structured. Some of them were not structured at all. Some of them had a bit of structure. Some of them didn't. And when you're talking to data and reporting, right, being able to speak the same language, and when I say language, the same types of data, the same types of reporting to 20 different teams is massively complex, especially when you have a global organization who each culture thinks about things differently and has a slightly nuanced approach to what the data is and how to use the reporting. Each one of those 20 teams, same way. So you have to understand the larger puzzle of how everyone fits together and start to pull apart who needs what to be able to effectively do their job. I think in society as a whole, we've said data, data, data. You have to have all the data. Sometimes you don't need all the data, because sometimes that creates that data paralysis that you hear about. You need to have the stuff that's going to make an impact on where you are currently and where you're headed. And so what I would do is I would sit down with each one of those groups and say, okay, what information do you need to be able to do your job? And then try to understand how to group those people into a larger team that says, okay, these people need to know this information. These other people need to know this information. And can I create that from the same data sources, from the same reports, without making it too complicated? Can this person have an extra couple columns or an extra couple of data points and still be able to maneuver through the data efficiently?
Yeah.
And so I think that's what I started to do. I started to look at those different groups, try to put them into even bigger understandings of what the data points were, and then create reporting that spoke specifically to them and tried to be as cohesive and comprehensive as possible without being overwhelming, which can be difficult with data.
Well, and I would imagine that through that process, you're also making sure that there's consistency in that data, reporting, because team A, needs it to look like this. Team B needs it like that, but the underlying data is all there, and there's that consistency. My follow-up question then would be, your comment about data paralysis, I think, is salient, because particularly when you think about not working with the 20 teams, but executive reporting. So at the executive level, you are likely, you have to make sure that you're not sharing all of the data. Because
it has to be an overview.
Exactly. And it's going to be what's most critical that's going to be driving the business. So how do you sort of discern from, the plethora of data that's there, the subset of that goes to the 20 teams, and then the subset of that goes to executive leadership? How do you drill in even further with your lens?
Right. And I think it comes to, what do most leaders want to know? They want to know, how much are you spending? What is the return on your investment? Like, where are the watch out spots? Like, where are the areas where you need to use caution? Where are the things that are obvious obstacles that are coming out of those are the things you call out. You call out the things that matter the most to them when they're making decisions. And I think it's been very interesting over the last few companies that I've worked at. It looks very different depending on what company you work at. Um, and I think that when you talk to most people, it's so easy to say, oh, I've got this 20-page deck that I need to share because there's so much information. It's so important.
And I need to
Yeah,
share.
it is important. Yeah, it is important to you. But have you sat across the desk from someone or the conference table or across the Zoom from someone and said, what does this look like and feel like to you? Because many times I'm sitting in meetings and saying, you're speaking at me. We're not having a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
We're not having a conversation about what the pain points are. We're having a conversation about all the data that you have.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not able to pull out the really important critical pieces of those of what that data is showing you.
Mm-hmm.
So you're having problems converting it. So when I start to think about the things that the SLT would want to know, I start to look at it from their perspective. Like, do you want to know that I shipped 200 orders in the last week? No, you want to know that we were able to provide, this many events with their, they want to know at a high level, how are we functioning overall?
Mm-hmm.
And what are the things that are stopping us from functioning even better? And I think so many times when you get into data and reporting and decks and all of this communication within businesses, we forget to look across the table. We forget to talk to the people that we're meeting with, to give them understanding and to give them insight into that analytics. What we're so worried about doing is delivering analytics.
Yeah, and that it's collaborative because,
Right,
for me,
right.
one of the things that I say often is that no one has a monopoly on knowledge. And so
Right.
therefore, by presenting from a marketing perspective the data that you have, the reporting of it, et cetera, that is, to your point, that is, by its very nature, a one-way direction. But staying open to receiving the feedback about, could we change it that way? Or I think I would want to see more of this information. Then it becomes more of a collaboration, and that starts to continue to reinforce the teamwork. Now, my question then would be, so the advice that you had about both discerning the information that goes to executive leadership and your advice on how to do that felt really, really good, useful, and universal. My question then would be, so what differences then have you seen coming from, say, Adidas to now being at Indeed? That's an interesting shift that I'd love to explore here because, you're right in that stage of leaving an organization that you had been at for a while, now starting at a new organization and learning that, what's happening in the new org, the transition. So can you talk a little bit about that, what you've learned along the way during this transition?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I think I was at Adidas for almost 15 years and had traveled I started on the East Coast, traveled to the West Coast, went from being in one of the customer service areas into being with corporate, had a lot of interaction with global, which is out of Germany. And I loved my time there, and the people were awesome. One of the things that I found that was difficult was trying to figure out how to use someone like me who is operational to her core. So if you ask me what my favorite board game is, it's a puzzle. I love puzzles. I love to figure things out. I want to make things better. I love making an impact. I like to improve upon things, and I'm very open to change. And when we started talking about with my manager where did I fit into the organization at Adidas, it just was such a struggle to have those conversations, because if your foundation isn't strong and you need somebody to fix it, but you're not hiring somebody to fix it, where do those people go? Like, where do the people go that do that are just naturally drawn that way, and their strengths are there? And so when I started to look, okay, I've been here for almost 15 years, you know, I'm not making the progress I feel like I want to make. I'm not making the impact I feel like I want to make. Where do I go? And so I started looking around, and I was very specific in what I was looking for. I was looking for someplace that um, I could make a global impact. I could live my purpose, which is to help people. And then I could try to navigate growing myself even more and trying to learn more and trying to learn about how to do things the best way I can, right? Because that's, at the end of the day, that's what I want to do. So when I started to make those choices and started to talk about those conversations, it was super scary, right? Because, I was comfortable. I was very, very comfortable. I had contacts, everywhere across the world. I knew our go-to-market milestones. I knew our processes. I built many of them, or had a huge hand in building many of them from a market level. So I was in North American market, which is North America and Canada. But I had worked extensively with global. And so I was like, oh, this is gonna be weird. So now moving out of that space, however daunting that is still exciting, because you get a chance to test those skills that you've been working on that you really didn't get a chance to use previously.
Mm-hmm.
And coming into a global role where it's specifically global, I've been able to use my past experience, but I've also struggled with the whole, I'm used to being from a product company. A product company moves very differently than a tech company. And so, the cadences and the milestones and the way that things are structured are very different. And so I'm navigating that right now. I'm 2.5 months into Indeed. And it's fascinating. Daunting at times, for sure, but fascinating to understand a completely new business. It's allowed me to tap into some of those strengths that I believe that are just core to who I am, but also to start to look at it in a different way and say, okay, what else can I learn? What else can I do that maybe in the past I was told, that's just really not something we're looking at you to provide.
Sure.
So it's been very interesting, and it's been, I think, a good move. It's always bittersweet to leave
Oh, sure.
behind the comfort.
Well, particularly with
Whew,
15 years. Well, and
yeah,
the thing that I think was
and the
very
people.
interesting,
Yeah.
and the people, exactly. And a comment that you made, I think, is really sort of fascinating to think about is, in a previous role, and I'm saying this more universally,
Right.
but using your story, for an example. But, in a specific role, a marketing operations role, you're in that role for 15 years. That role is going to hone very specific skills.
Hmm.
And at the same time, the tools that you're using, the tools, the skills, the knowledge, etc., will get worn in a specific way to
Right.
optimize, the things you do. That process,
Hmm.
15 seasons, 15 years, etc. That. But then you make that shift, and now your comment about moving from a product company to a technology company. And
Right.
so now you're at the technology company, and the people that are there have that same wear and tear on their skills. But now you're coming in having many skills, honed and
Right.
worn in a way that is perfected to that sort of go to market. And now some of that is being used, but other aspects, other knowledge, skills, abilities have to now come in. And so
Hmm.
what's fascinating about how you describe that is how exciting that is to make you even more well-rounded, polishing other skills, strengthening the strengths that you have, and identifying other areas to say, well, I always knew this, but let me demonstrate X.
Right.
So I find that really, really fascinating. Now, one thing that is interesting that I'd like to dig in a little bit further on is something maybe more broadly, or a broader topic, and that is think about like if I look at when you were in that product company, and at Adidas, things like topics like sustainability. And I know that when you were in that role, you worked with all sorts of teams on, waste reduction and sustainability, and, how do you sort of bring that? When you think about now being at a technology company or any company, when you're thinking about sustainability topics, how do you sort of look at that? Or what advice can you give to any marketing operations executives, particularly if they are working in a product space where sustainability could be a very front of mind topic, or a technology company or any other company? How do you bring those experiences that you have in sustainability to another space?
It's really interesting. I did not obviously plan to be in sustainability. It wasn't even really a thing when I first started in Adidas. We didn't talk about it very often. Um, and when I moved from the role in East Coast and went to the West Coast and became part of the marketing operations organization in Samples, it just became so abundantly clear that there was so much waste. I mean, from a process perspective, the way we went about doing it was just so much waste. And one of my favorite stories from when I was a kid was the Lorax. And I had forever a picture on my desk, and this is before, obviously, this became a thing, that said "unless." And it had the little pedestal. And if you haven't heard the story of the Lorax, it's by Dr. Seuss. First of all, go get it. Even though it's a kid's book, you should definitely get into it. But basically, there's this guy that speaks up, and as people are commercializing and taking over this area, he speaks for the trees, and he speaks for the barbaloots, and he speaks for all of these animals that can't speak for themselves. And the whole point of it is, unless somebody does something about it, unless you speak up, unless you take a stance, nothing's going to change. And so I started, with that little seed in the back of my head, and started to go, okay, well, what can I do? We already have this partnership with a great group called Souls for Souls, and they're out of Nashville. And we already had a partnership with them for some of the things that we could not do anything else with. And I said, well, how do we strengthen that? So I got in touch with them, and I started talking to them, and I said, well, we do this with you, but could we do this with you? And they said, well, let's see, let's talk about it. Let's have a conversation. And I think that is the piece of advice I would give to anyone. If you see it, say something. Mm-hmm. If you know there's a way to change it, to make it better. I just recently was in an offsite and said, okay, they have recycling in this one little room, but why don't they have recycling in these other 4 spaces where people are throwing everything into one trash can? And so even being just part of that was feedback I gave from being at that offsite was, yes, we recycled in this one particular room, but we didn't recycle in any of the other rooms. You can always see it, say something. And then as you're thinking about processes, especially in marketing operations, in product or in any other space, when you start to put together what that foundation looks like, what those processes, what those procedures look like, always in the back of your head, have that in your mind, like, how do we make more efficient use of our time together? How do we make sure that when we meet somewhere, it's not just cost effective, but it's sustainability? Can we meet somewhere where there's only a few people that have to fly in, everybody else can use a train, or are already located there? Mm-hmm. Can we try to find sustainable ways to not print out as much materials? Digital has grown immensely, but I still get, papers in my mailbox every week that
Sure.
are 30, 40 pieces of paper that really I don't want.
Well,
so how do we think about those things in a way that's smarter And it's a way that's more sustainable to the earth we live on.
And that's the transferable part is that I could
Right.
see in your example is, you had so much responsibility and focus on identifying waste that, again, back to the skills that get honed, that was something that you became very skilled at, is to identify waste. And so I would imagine, again, that skill transfers over. So now at Indeed, I'm sure you're looking and observing and, why are we doing that report? Or why are we doing it this way?
Right.
It would seem it would be easier that way. Now, you talked a little bit about, a paper and some of the things that you receive. That actually could be a good segue here to another topic that I'm curious about, and that's on physical marketing impressions. So when you think about physical marketing impressions at Indeed, things like, think about like marketing kits, trade show graphics, direct mail, packaging, any sort of printed output that Indeed is producing for its customers, either B2B or B2C. How are you sort of currently, or what are you learning about Indeed, about how you are incorporating physical marketing along with the digital marketing to create that sort of cohesive omni-channel marketing strategy?
Yeah. So the other day, and again, fairly new into the company, so I'm learning a lot about what they're doing in this space. But the other day, I was able to read up on when we go to a college, when we go to a trade show. Obviously there's things that people take with them. Like what makes the most, what is reusable? What are you printing one time? What are you printing one time for 50 times of use? So there is a lot of thought going behind those types of printable goods or things that you may give out, QR codes, right? Instead of having like a whole pamphlet, do you have one like postcard that has a QR code that gives more information, right? As we start to think about our lives within a digital world, and this goes for even when I was with Adidas, you're never going to get away from a physical thing, right? People still want to see and hold something before they decide to buy 10,000 of them, right?
Yeah.
You're going to do that. But how do you do that in the most sustainable way? How do you do it so that you're as clear as possible about what the return on it is going to be, what the value of it is? How do you produce things that that people really respond to? And I'll give a great example. When I got my welcome kit from Indeed, my oldest son, who's almost 15, or sorry, almost 16 now, wanted to open the package because, every day is Christmas when you get to open the mail. And so he went in and he opened it up and there were things in there, but it was so smartly done. It was, a pair of socks, totally would use, right? But now in the little sign that said, now that you are with us, you need to learn how to like walk in somebody else's shoes. Here's the socks that'll help you get started. Like little things like that are usable. It still gets the name out there. It still gives somebody a warm fuzzy to receive it. But it's smart, right? Instead of just like another cup or another, 36-page pamphlet of how we started and where we're going, it was a pair of socks that immediately I wore like within that week. And it was, a bag that I could carry my stuff in. It was an air tag. So those are smart things that people will use and are not just waste.
Yeah, what a great example, because it is the promotional items or the things that are in that new employee welcome kit are tied to the theme, the values of the company, something that makes sense and obviously welcomes you, and obviously it made a very positive impact on you. That's wonderful. Are there other, if you think about your own career, so that's an example of you being on the receiving end, are there other sort of marketing operations initiatives that you've been involved in or that you've driven that are memorable to you that come to the top of your mind?
Well, So when I left, when I left Adidas, and this everybody thinks that you hear this job and you're like, oh, that sounds like the best job ever. Um, I was in the promotional space. So product that goes out for promotional needs goes out to your partners, goes out to your collaborators, goes out to your social media influencers for every launch, right? And it is an exciting space. It's extremely you don't get that stuff. So just everybody just know it sounds really cool, but you don't get to have that pair of Beyonce shoes. You get to send them out there. But I think collaborations that were really cool. Pharrell had for one of our shoes relaunching. He came in and said, I want 50 colorways. And I just remember the story of 50 colors, and everybody goes, oh, this is impossible, right? We can't do this. And everybody's like, no, it's Adidas. Nothing's impossible. Um, but he had such a great premise. He said, I want it to be in so many different shades that it appeals to everybody. And he wanted in the insole to have the reflexology map of a foot in these shoes. And I remember we sent shoes to a photo shoot, and it's him sitting in the middle of this floor with like circles of shoes around him in all these different colors. But it was super impactful because I feel like in those moments when somebody can share their vision and it comes across so clearly and so well done and it's so inclusive, I think that was one that stuck with me. And then I think, you know, there are moments where Super Bowls, right? We're putting, shoes on athletes. We're putting, you're seeing stuff in magazines, you're seeing stuff in movies, right? And you're going, oh, I even do it now. I mean, I've been gone for several months, and we were at the airport. I was at in New York, um, coming off the train and still looking down at people's shoes. I want to see what people, I'm still looking at people's Adidas wear, right?
Well,
I'm still doing it when I watch the NFL. If I'm seeing it on a movie, I'm like, oh, they've got on Stan Smiths.
you're at a meeting at Indeed. You're looking at their shoes.
People have actually said to me, I came dressed for the meeting for you because they'll have them like a zip up and it's got Adidas on it. Um, but yeah, I think those moments that made the impression on me were ones where we were just able to create a true cohesive vision that was really inclusive and really spoke to the partner we were with, um, and really translated that to the masses. I think those to me were the most impressive that I worked on.
That's wonderful. Well, and you also mentioned earlier that one of your core values is to help people. So, can you just talk a little bit more about, why is it those sort of social missions, social purpose? Why is that so important to you?
I think I really think that it comes to being part of a family that was, I don't want to say, we were not out there doing this all the time, but like my dad just had a very strong sense of purpose and a sense of drive. My mom was the person that took everybody in. So our family, when it would snow, which in the South it rarely ever did, so no one knows how to drive in the snow. My dad would grab his truck and they'd fill the back of the truck with wood, and he'd grab some chains and he'd go pull people out of ditches. Knights of Columbus Hall. My father was the grand person for a while, and we were there every weekend doing meals or doing fundraisers and that type of thing. And I think that leaves an impression on you as a child. But then as you start to grow older, you start to see what your privilege is, right? You start to recognize that you have opportunities that other people don't have. You start to look at society and you start to see and you start to open up your eyes and understand more. And I think for
Hmm.
me in those moments, I started to really take that as a personal I started to take it as a personal thing to say, well, what can I do to help?
Yeah.
And, the famous quote for Mr. Rogers was, his mom telling him, like, whenever you see these moments, you look for the people that are going to help. And I think for me, especially coming into some of my roles, for example, with Adidas, where I was connected with Souls for Souls, I was able to go to Haiti and I was able to see the micro enterprise that they do. And I was able to explain it to people coming back and say, this is why we do this. You may not get your 50th pair of shoes, but somebody that needs these to work in doesn't care that they're, a little scuffed up from our sales meeting, right?
Yeah.
And so it
Yeah.
was easy for me to start to weave that in. And then as I started to do more and more, it's like you start to see it more and more, right?
Yeah.
You
And it
know,
feeds on itself. It
oh
feeds
yeah,
on
for
itself,
sure.
and it just makes you feel good.
Yeah, and
But
then,
what?
going into Black Lives Matter, I was actually helping reform the women's ERG at the time and realized, you have quite a few white, middle class, middle-aged women making decisions based on without any input coming from other people that have different plights, have different levels of privilege, have different, you know, needs for what this
Experiences and
experience
yeah.
needs to be for them and how to make their lives better within our organization and outside of it. So just recognizing those things, learning, continually open your mind to those things. I think it does feed off itself, and I think it becomes even more important over time.
Yeah, beautiful stories. Thank you. So before we wrap up today's episode, so what is the main takeaway that you want to share to understand the challenges facing marketing operations executives today?
To be blatantly honest and to be very transparent, I think the biggest thing is that people are not taking the time to build out that foundation to be inclusive, to be productive, to be effective and efficient. Um, as a society, we're so busy running forward all the time, we forget to look back and go, what worked and what didn't. We're not learning from our mistakes. We're not taking the time to say, hey, we're moving so fast that if we don't pivot soon, we're going to run off, we're going to run off in the wrong direction. And I think many times in operations, you have the moments where we need people to speak up. Hey, this is not going the way it should be going. Get, radical candor, get out there, say it in the best way you can to make, people understand that we need to do things differently. We need to pivot. We need to be agile. We need to change. And then the other piece of that is being open to the change that comes and allowing that change, like thinking about it in a very honest and transparent way, asking questions to make sure it's the right change. I think
Yeah.
sometimes the business world makes change to make change, because if they don't make change, somehow they're losing out, or they're not one-upping the next person in line or beside them. And I think that change is great if it's smart. If it works, if it's what you need to do, that's why we need to evolve. But you've got to build out that foundation. You've got to listen. You've got to speak up, and you've got to make sure that you're not just part of the machine. You're making the machine work better.
Yeah, I love the line. Change is great if it's smart. Well, that wraps up this episode of The Art of Marketing Operations. Thank you so much for joining us today, Debra.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Well, until next time, stay safe and take care.
Thank you for listening to The Art of Marketing Operations, brought to you by Taylor. Don't forget to hit subscribe in your favorite podcast player. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and share. Until next time.